Hi, welcome to Season 3, Episode 1 of the Radical Bible, as we begin the exciting exploration of the books of Samuel, which at one level we could call the David story, but plainly the stories about David and much more. And so, as we jump in, let's just consider a few things that are challenging about how to read this exciting story. If we just started reading about David, we're going to miss all kinds of stuff. The story starts like this. There was a certain man of Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And so, these are characters that are obviously not familiar to readers of the Bible. In general, Elkanah, not a major character. And when is this and where is this? He's from the hill country of Ephraim, but where is he now? And so many questions. So that's what happens if we just start on the first sentence and try to read it that way. But it's not nearly as simple as that. Because unlike Genesis, which starts the Bible, or Revelation, which ends the Bible, the books of Samuel are somewhere about in the middle. And so one of the things we have to look at is what's its relationship with all the texts around it. So let's just jump right in here, and I want to explore just some of these issues, all of which people have spent their entire careers on, any one of these issues, and we're not going to do that. But if we don't pay some attention to this, we will easily misread the story in a number of ways, as we'll see. So who wrote it, when, why? Here are just some options. So one of the issues is that Solomon succeeds David as king, and so is it written by apologists for the Solomonic regime to explain why Solomon followed David? We'll explore some of that. Is it later? The 10th century is the time of the events, at least the first events. Is this an 8th century, in other words, 200-year later justification for later kings? Much like perhaps we would write now about the Civil War, or more precisely, the War of 1812, about the same time period. How about a little later as a justification for later kings and their reforms that we'll see in the second book of Kings? Perhaps it's written to explain how Jerusalem ended at the time of exile by the Babylonians, or maybe a little later a Persian-era justification for rebuilding, or even later a Hellenistic-era justification for maintaining national identity around Jerusalem, or some combination of those, with different authors having written different pieces and different editors having worked it all together. We're going to explore some of that in just a moment. How about on its message? Is it for the monarchy or against it, or some combination thereof? Because at one level, we'll see 1 Samuel 8 makes having a king a big sellout and abandoning Yahweh as the only king that Israelites should have. At the same time, it offers in 2 Samuel 7 a promise that someone will be on the throne from the house of David forever. So is it pro-monarchy, anti-monarchy, or are there competing views? What is the relationship between this narrative and real events? Is it a transcript of events? Almost certainly not. Is it completely fiction? Probably not. Some combination of those, and then we'd have to explore how any history is a combination of quote-unquote real events and an author's perspective. We won't get into a lot of detail on that, but we need to explore it. What can we learn from outside the text? How can archaeology assist us in answering some of these questions, providing information about the quote-unquote real world, or perhaps can reveal things from other empires and other regions, Canaanites, Egyptians, and others whose writings might tell us something, as we'll see. The oldest reference to somebody named David, or a house of David, comes from a foreign text, as we'll see, on a piece of stone. Some of the challenges, of course, are you can't excavate under Jerusalem because it's a living city. So the places where David was and Solomon was are the hardest places to try to explore archaeologically. And the existing evidence is ambiguous, and archaeologists argue endlessly over the meaning of things, much like historical or literary scholars argue about the meaning of texts. But words are usually found in their wholeness, although not always, because scraps of text from the ancient world exist as well. But archaeology rarely reveals the whole picture, usually just bits and pieces that have to be inferred of how they go together. We'll explore more of that as we go too. What's the relation between the story of the monarchy in 1st and 2nd Samuel and a clean version in 1st and 2nd Chronicles? The scholarly consensus is that Chronicles is later, but there's a debate about the relationship. And what about the fact that both stories are in the collection we know as the Bible? The wild, sexy, violent version in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and the much cleaned up PG version in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. How about the relation between 1 Samuel and other texts, earlier texts of the Bible, earlier in the sense of whether they're written earlier or earlier in the sense of they're earlier in the story? So as we'll see momentarily, there are many connections to Genesis, although if you've watched any of my Genesis series so far, you'd see that my view, like many scholars today, is that the Genesis narrative is primarily written during the exile. And if the David story was written earlier, then Genesis is commenting on the David story rather than the David story knowing about Genesis. We'll explore that as we go. How about the ongoing relationship between the entire history from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, known as the Deuteronomistic history? That's a mouthful, but it simply means Deuteronomy in an adjective form. Deuteronomistic history from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings. We'll explore that in a moment. And how about with the Torah, with the Exodus in particular and early Moses tradition? So all of these are real questions. Did the authors know of Exodus or Genesis or Joshua or Judges? Or were those stories written later beyond the scope to give readers a perspective if they don't know that those earlier texts chronologically in the story world were actually later chronologically in the writing world? Confused yet? I'm sure you might be, and that's why we're going to do this one step at a time. And then finally, what's the relation between 1 and 2 Samuel and later texts? We certainly know in the New Testament that Jesus is declared son of David, but what does that mean exactly? He's certainly not going to be a king like David. He's certainly not a warrior like David. So why was it important to associate Jesus hundreds of years later, from whenever the text of 2 Samuel 7 was written, with this nonviolent Messiah? And then also, there's ongoing debate on the relationship between other voices at the time, including the Dead Sea Scrolls and their community. And I have the New World here, Terrence Malick, to highlight how even in our American story, as we'll explore, we go back over and write our history again, telling it from a different lens. So Terrence Malick's recent film, The New World, shows a different version of the John Smith Pocahontas romance than maybe you grew up with when you were a kid in school. So those are some of the questions, and what I want to do now is just begin the process of unpacking some of that. So I'm going to put up on the screen a series of book covers of books from authors that I think are related to the question we're about. But before I do that, we have to at least consider a couple of things that make this even more ambiguous than it is already. One is this question. So we have here the historical narrative in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis to 2 Kings. And as I was just suggesting, what is the relationship amongst some of these? The Torah is these first 5 books. As I have here, my views on when some of these were written, and I won't go over that in detail. You can see that for yourself. But did the authors of these texts know these or not? According to my view, probably not, at least not for the most part. But is really the division between these 5 books and these books here? Many scholars would call Genesis to Joshua the Hexateuch, hexa for 6 as opposed to penta for 5, suggesting that Joshua follows consistently with Deuteronomy, which it certainly does. Deuteronomy has Moses leaving the people on the edge of the Jordan River to cross over, and the book of Joshua, of course, narrates their crossing, and Joshua is succeeding Moses as the leader and engaging in conquest of some of the peoples of the land. But then what's the relation between that story and the story in Judges of a bunch of miscellaneous people over an unspecified period of time fighting off Philistines and Aramites and others in the area? And then if you read the Bible in sequence, I put it in brackets here, we have the book of Ruth, which most scholars would say is from a much later time period, but it ends with the narration of the genealogy of David. And then we have the books of Samuel, and then we have the books of Kings. And in the books of Samuel, there's all kinds of detail about Saul and David and all kinds of drama, whereas in most of the books of Kings, it goes flat. The characters we're not told much about. They don't do many things. They reign for a certain period of time. Maybe they fight a war, but they only last a few paragraphs in the narration. So why such an emphasis on these characters here? Here's a couple possibilities, and one of them comes from David Jobling, and I'll put his book cover up right here. At one level, a standard commentary from a standard scholarly commentary series. But his view is that to read this, we can't read the books of Samuel as we have them now. We need to read them as starting from Judges 2:11, and we'll look later at what that might mean, up through 1 Samuel 12 as one consistent extended Judges. In other words, the time period before Saul becomes a king. And then here from 1 Samuel 13 to 2 Samuel 7 is the time of Saul's reign, the time of Saul and David's struggle, and then the promise that Yahweh gives via Nathan to David that someone will from his house, from the house of David, will rule on the throne forever. But what about what follows? What about the decline of the house of David? And what about the succession of Solomon? Which leads a number of scholars to see a Davidic apology, an explanation for why David ruled rather than Saul, and especially why David ruled over the northern area of Israel, or the tribal area of Benjamin that Saul was from, in addition to the area that he claimed in the south in Judah, which we'll see. And then why was Solomon his successor? David had many wives and many sons, and so why does Solomon succeed him? And maybe there's a narration from that time period that justifies why Solomon will succeed him. Here we can look at the cover of Baruch Halpern's book. Halpern is a Hebrew Bible scholar, but he uses a combination of literary tools and archaeology to try to sort out what we can know is likely what really happened and what is political propaganda here. So you can see from the title of his book, he has a very critical approach to the question of David and how he's characterized. Similarly, Joel Baden here, as you can see, is also raising questions about the relationship between the real events and the story here, suggesting that the character in the story has been invented for purposes that we'll get to as we go, very different from any actual historical David character. This brings up another approach to the reading of these books, apart from which connections, which texts go with which, but what the themes are. And so here's a pair of books, from first one from Halpenstall and Holmes, and also from Michael Walzer, about the question of politics. Politics, obviously not the way we understand it in the limited sense of voting for somebody, but politics in the sense of where power is and how things get done in society, and what the role of a king is in that. And that will have some resonance, not just for power in their world, but for power in our world. And then also there's another approach that puts all that stuff aside and just reads it as the story we have it. And so Meyer Sternberg, whose cover you can see here, and Robert Polzen's cover that you can see here, are two literary critics who put aside all the cultural context and historical stories to simply read from within the text of what we learn there about how people are characterized. Some of the many ways of reading this story that we'll have to grapple with. And then finally, oddly, those writers are almost all Jewish writers, although not exclusively, but just about all. Halpern, Baden, Halpenstall and Holmes, Walzer and Sternberg are all Jewish writers. But then why is it that a Catholic priest, Robert Barron, in his commentary, again from a standard commentary set, feels the need to defend David as a holy hero, and even accused Bathsheba of being a temptress in that incident, infamously, where David ends up having her Bathsheba's husband killed in battle. All the Jewish scholars are willing to portray David as a horrible scumbag, an almost evil person for doing that, but why does the Catholic priest feel a need to defend a David as if David was a model for Jesus? So people's presuppositions about what they expect the text to be about affects it in many ways. We will be exploring all these things as we go. So a couple of other things to look at to fill in some of the issues here. I provided here, and I will we'll go through this as we see, a little bit of a table of contents, much like you might see on a cable TV show where there's a one-liner about the next episode. So I will post this so you can go through this and follow as we go, and I'll post it for each video as we go. There's also a list of characters here, and so many characters. I'll make that a little bigger so you can see that, and I've divided them up by houses. So first we'll see the house of Eli in these first chapters, and then we'll see the house of Saul, and then of course we'll see the house of David as we go. And many, many characters, as you can see, and then others along the way, including Philistines and foreign opponents and various allies along the way. So many, many characters, and again, I'll provide these along the way to keep us from getting lost. One of the issues in the bigger picture of the timeline is, here's the timeline of the story we're looking at, and here's when the books are, but what about all these other events out here? So if you're not familiar with the timeline of the history of Israel, here's this, and you can freeze that and copy that if you like, if you want to have a picture of some of that. in relation to what I was exploring in that first table about relations with other texts. Let's just look at a couple of things. As Jobling pointed out, the relationship with Judges is a key thing, and here you see just some of the links between Judges and 1 Samuel. We see a number of those along the way, and there are quite a few. Again, I won't go through those in detail, but that certainly highlights that there are narrative links between these. So if we start at 1 Samuel and we haven't read Judges, we're probably going to be missing something. But perhaps more strangely, there are many links between these stories and Genesis. So here are some links between the story of the fall of the house of David, starting with the rape of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13, and other rape stories and other characters of similar names. A lot of links there between Genesis and the fall of the house of David. But that's also true in a very specific way. If we were to start backwards with the Laban story in Genesis, Laban, the father, of course, of Rachel and Leah, who Jacob goes to get a wife from, his cousin, so to speak. And what is the relation between that story and this? Is Genesis commenting ironically on the monarchy from some later time? Could be. We'll have to figure that out as we go. And then from a chart from my book, Come Out My People, where you can see perhaps an even stranger comparison between the portrayal of Solomon and the portrayal of Pharaoh in Exodus. And as you can see here, there are very specific words that are very close, and we'll have to see what is the relationship between these stories. So Genesis, Exodus, Judges all have various echoes into the story of David, both before or after. So these are just some of the many issues. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, please don't worry about it. Take a deep breath. We're going to go through these one thing at a time. In our next session, of course, we'll begin in the first verses, and we'll see how the little story of Elkanah and his wives might just be a parable about what's to follow. All right? So I look forward to seeing you next time as we dig into the first chapter of 1 Samuel. Bye-bye.